What an incredible first half of International Women's Day we've just experienced. A big hello to you wherever you're joining us from today, the office, at home, at school or elsewhere. I'm MARLEE Silva and it's a pleasure to be able to share today with you. As a proud Aboriginal woman from the Gamilaroi and Dunghutti tribes, I'd like to begin by paying my respects to all First Nations people who are connected to the land you're joining us from today. I wish to acknowledge their elders, past and present. And in making this acknowledgement, I too acknowledge the ways First Nations people have maintained an unbroken and intertwining connection and a relationship of reciprocal needs and benefits between them and their traditional lands and waterways. Always was, always will be. The guests at each of our live events are now enjoying some networking time. So, across the next 15 minutes, I'm going to be sharing my own story with you. This is a story of my journey to where I am today. From school-age MARLEE, who was a pretty frustrated and at times angry kid, to 26-year-old MARLEE, who now is considerably less angry and has achieved and learned way more than she ever thought she would. And to do that, I'm going to take you back in time with me now, all the way to Darawal country, which is south of Sydney, at a place called Cronulla, and at my local public high school circa 2008. Growing up where I did, in the Sutherland Shire, an area that is known for horrifying race riots that occurred in the early 2000s, and is unsurprisingly high in its white Anglo-Saxon population and low in its Indigenous one, I understood my place and my family's place to be on the outer of my community from a young age. Although within the walls of my house, the absolute best thing you could be was Aboriginal. My family's pride and strength couldn't protect me from the outside world. So, the first time I realised I was different to my peers came a mere few weeks after I started high school. It was a rainy Friday afternoon. And like most Year 7s do as they're finding their social circle in high school, I'd made a new best friend for the week. I remember her and I sprinting through the rain, laughing down the long driveway from the maths block to the bus bay where I'd usually get picked up, when a voice calling out my name brought us to a halt. I looked up to see a man by the school gate, holding a big umbrella and wearing bright blue gumboots. It was my dad. And I was mortified. Not just because of the gumboots, but because they were paired with pyjamas. Mind you, he's a shift worker and was probably napping after a night shift before he came to pick me up. But when you're 12 years old, that might as well be any chance to be cool at school down the drain. He'd gotten out of the car to make sure that I didn't get wet, which is undeniably very sweet. But at the time, I certainly couldn't see that. Anyway, I was furious at him for a good chunk of the weekend, but assumed it would be forgotten by my new best friend who'd been beside me by the time we got back to class on the Monday. But of course, lo and behold, second period science Monday morning came around and my new best friend swiveled around on the chair ahead of me to ask who had picked me up from school on that Friday. I seriously considered acting dumb or making up some sort of lie, but eventually I did admit that that was my no-shame having dad. What I expected to happen next was that she might burst into laughter about his pyjamas, but that's not even close to what happened. This classmate of mine paused for a moment, obviously a little puzzled, before she asked, "Is he your real dad or your stepdad?" I was pretty dumbfounded. Yeah, I'm pretty sure he's my real dad. To which she replied with one of the most defining questions of my life up to that point. Why is your dad black? Never in my life had I heard someone be called a colour like that. I mean, we called ourselves blackfellas as Aboriginal people, and my mum wasn't one, but in our house it didn't make us different to each other any more than if mum was in the sun too long in summer, she'd go red, and if dad was, he'd get browner. It took me a minute, but I realised what she was talking about was the fact that dad is Aboriginal. We're Aboriginal, I told her, and she managed to shock me one more time by replying, "Wow, I've never met an Aboriginal person before." From this point, it was as if my identity was outed to the school. Not that I ever hid it, just people never assumed anything because of what I looked like. Something that had undeniably given me a kind of white privilege, which I hadn't recognised until that point. But ultimately, this moment was followed by months and years of schooling full of questions and questioning of my identity, of racist jokes and of stereotypes. Unfortunately, served to me by both students and teachers. Plus, a lot of teachers who'd call me out as a kind of expert of Indigenous history in class or point me out unnecessarily when any Aboriginal-related topic in any subject came up. And in its worst example, it saw graffiti plastered on school property by my classmates stating, "MARLEE SILVA sniffs petrol." It might not surprise you to know that by my senior years, I was a pretty angry teenager. I struggled socially. At the time, I thought that I was inept or had something wrong with me that made it hard for me to maintain friendships or flourish in social settings. But in hindsight, I can see that my personality, beliefs, and particularly my loud opinions related to the injustices and racism faced by my people played a huge role in my sense of feeling like an outcast. And while I distinctly remember getting to a point where I told my parents that I hated school, I just couldn't wait for it all to be over, one of the places I found solace and the way that I got through it was by fully submerging myself in the books. When I was in the classroom and able to focus on my studies and shut everything else out, my head was a little quieter and my body felt at ease. The only other moments that gave me the joy and my purpose for continuing my study and working hard to prove to my peers, if I was going to be their only example of an Aboriginal person, I'd be the very best one, was when I was given opportunities to leave my school environment and participate in Aboriginal specific leadership programs, cultural days, and even dance events, where I'd be surrounded by kids and elders and role models who were just like me. It was also through the inspiration provided by stories of my own family, the previous generations of my lineage who fought to pave the path for future generations like my own. My dad's nan, my Nan Pearl, raised 10 children of her own and gave a home to a few more who just needed a place to stay on an Aboriginal mission in Moree, New South Wales, through a period in Australia's history where our people were treated, at best, as second-class citizens. Mind you, we weren't even counted as literal citizens until 1967. For almost a decade in those early years, she raised those kids in a tin humpy on a dried-up riverbed. She travelled a few k's into town and back every day, often with a few little ones hanging off her, to clean people's houses while her husband was shearing sheep. They were hassled constantly by local police on the mission, had to ask permission for just about everything from the mission master, and were completely ostracised by a great number of non-Indigenous people in their own community. Although I wouldn't have blamed her otherwise, my Nan Pearl spent her entire 92 years of life so far from bitterness. She was constantly giving love, giving cups of tea, giving wisdom and hope. In 1986, she was named Senior Citizen and Elder of the Year for her tireless community work. She was still volunteering for Meals on Wheels well into her 80s. And in an interview about her win, when she was asked how she'd made it through the tough times, Nan said, "You can't keep looking back, that we must always only look forward. Look to tomorrow, look to the path she carved for us, and figure out how we would continue paving it for the next." She had a motto that she lived by too: try not to give up. Nan Pearl then passed that motto on to her daughter Alice, my grandmother, my dad's mum, a similarly stoic, hardworking black woman. That attitude helped Nan Alice find the strength and resilience to turn up to high school every day, regardless of the obstacles she faced there. She was the only Aboriginal student at the time, and every day she would face an onslaught of racial slurs and quite often experience pretty disgusting bullying acts, like peers spitting on her. Despite it all, with "try not to give up" echoing in her mind, not only did she become the first Aboriginal graduate from her high school, but too, the first female Aboriginal graduate of a Bachelor of Social Work at the University of Sydney, which, not to mention, she attained while raising 5 children in Housing Commission in Western Sydney. Unfortunately, my Nan Alice, now in her later years of life, has been diagnosed with dementia, and there will be memories and stories that will be lost with her one day. But a few years back, when the disease was in its earliest stages, I was with Nan at a community event, and pretty devastated to see how it was already affecting her. She got confused and a bit anxious. She kept asking me my name too, but one thing that seemed unscathed were the memories of her achievements. More than once, she leaned over to me and she whispered with a little smirk, "Do you know I was the first Aboriginal woman to graduate from Sydney Uni?" When you're a trailblazer, out on the front lines, doing it so others can follow, I guess even as your mind starts to lose its way, your bone and your breath never forget it. She's also told me over and over again the stories of her work in her career as a social worker, how she'd travel all across the state looking out and fighting for vulnerable children. Whenever she got to a new town, she'd drive down the main street at night and stop and buy dinner for the kids out and about on their own, without parents like her mother before her had done. She led with such an innate passion for giving and caring, and it was recognised throughout her career, as she eventually rose to a director's position in the department she worked in, where she essentially worked as a top advisor. What might not be too surprising to some, a lot of her colleagues in the department couldn't handle seeing an Aboriginal woman striving like she had. They would whisper behind her back that she didn't deserve it. And when I asked her how she overcame this, she told me she did it by ignoring them, by working harder and doing even more. Nobody could stop her. And I couldn't help but imagine, on the hardest days, it was try not to give up that she told herself. By the time my dad Rodney, my nan's second youngest child, was born in 1967 as one of the first blackfellas to be counted as a citizen that year, he had try not to give up pumping through his veins. Dad says Nan is his greatest role model for how resilient she was during his upbringing, raising 5 kids with very little money and an abusive alcoholic husband to survive. He says she taught him to overcome, showed him what he wanted to be as a parent, and highlighted the sheer strength she had passed on to him and would eventually pass on to the next generation too. Try not to give up is my great-grandmother's legacy. I hear it as a message on loop, whispered over and over in my ears on the days life seems a little too hard. It sounds so simple, but it's reflective of an inherent belief in the fact that you have the power to determine your future. From these stories, and by being constantly reminded of the sacrifices made by my ancestors before me to ensure I had the chance for a brighter future at all, I knew whatever I do with my life when I grew up, it would involve giving back to the community that gave me hope and helped me survive. So, since escaping school as that angry teenager, what have I done? I completed study at university. I've worked and volunteered in the non-profit space, mostly with Aboriginal young people to help them stay at school. I've attended global leadership forums in Scotland. I won a scholarship to study at Stanford University in the States. I've worked with NBA stars. I wrote a book and I work in media. And best of all, I regularly get to do stuff like this, share my experience with women like yourself. Now, this is not to boast, and I'm not going to act like I planned any of this. So much of the opportunities I've had have come about by chance or by meeting the right people at the right time or a whole host of things that are completely out of my control. But they are also undeniably a byproduct of the sacrifice, hard work, and love given by my grandmothers to pave a path of possibility for me. I am privileged in many ways, but most of all, I am so privileged to have been raised by these stories of my grandmother and great-grandmother. Stories of overcoming unimaginable obstacles that are dotted with great lessons and advice that I believe are applicable to most women who aspire to lead or to reach new heights or pave new pathways as they did for me. The lessons they have taught me are, while structural barriers might make the path more difficult, day to day, each step we take, each small win we have adds up to success. Resilience is a muscle that requires constant training. And the most sustainable leadership is one driven by kindness, patience, and generosity. Kindness to yourself and those around you, patience with the process, and generosity in paving the path and turning back to let other women through behind you.